welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are continuing our discussion on Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Today, we're joined by Silvia Moreno-Garcia herself.
Hi, Silvia.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time. I'm Jorge Gomez. I was the one whom I was corresponding with you, but I'll let my colleagues here introduce themselves.
Oh, hi. I'm Richie Madrufo. Thanks for joining us today and looking forward to your visit in El Paso.
Yes, so excited. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Reina. And nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. So we're really excited to get you to have you visit here in El Paso and host you at UTEP. We are part of El Paso Community College, so we're working together, on this event. And as you know, we have our podcast here, Literary, where we talked about Mexican Gothic. And so if you don't mind, we have a few questions about that book and just kind of your overall work, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure thing.
I guess we'll have Vanessa get things started.
Yeah. Okay. So my question just had to do with your overall writing process, because I know a lot of your books tackle different genres in themselves. So I kind of wanted to know a little bit about how you go about, I lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh. How you go about the writing process when you're trying to do different genres. And if it changes between the genres.
It depends on the titles. Sometimes, like my first novel, Signal to Noise, I didn't quite know what category it could be slotted in. And I think to this day, people have a really hard time knowing what shelf it should be on. So that one, I didn't really think much of what it should be in the end. But with other books or novellas, it's an exercise of seeing if I can do something. So I sometimes have said, can I write a sword and sorcery, or can I write a quest story with a hero's journey? And then I go on in that direction. So it varies by the title.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I guess since we're talking about different genres and your novels, your books not being able to be placed very particularly on specific shelves, in preparation for this interview, I was reading another interview that you did with New York Times a couple years ago. And there you talked about the magic realism label and how it sometimes, quote, strangled rather than liberated Latin American literature. So I was hoping you could expand on that, because I think it's such an important conversation piece to have, especially for those of us who teach your work or similar work.
Yeah, so magic realism originally applied to kind of a specific movement in a very kind of short time period, and it was the 1960s in Latin America, sort of, more or less. It's like when we talk about Dadaism in painting, we're not talking about all painting after the year 1900. Dadaism is a specific movement with some aesthetic principles, and we can kind of constrain it to a certain time period. When we talk about spaghetti westerns, we know we're referring to Italian westerns that were made in the 1970s specifically, not every western that was made forever. And the problem with the term magic realism is that it went from being this kind of label that described a movement to describing anything that came out of Latin America. And magic realism happened, the movement as we saw it, a long, long time ago. So people in Latin America, they're not writing like the 1960s is what, 60 years ago? They're not writing like that. So by the 1990s, we saw people, young writers at that point, now they're, older writers, going against and writing in opposition to the rural town feeling of things like Macondo. And so they coined this movement that is Mac Ondo, but like McDonald's, MC Ondo. And it's about the reality of Latin American cities, globalization, social class clashes, political economy, popular culture lived in the cities. And so this movement in the 1990s is directly in opposition to the kind of old-timey idea of Latin American literature and what magic realism was. And so that was in the 1990s when I was a teenager. So as you can imagine, I'm no longer a teenager anymore. I'm in my 40s. So the magic realism label is even more removed from me at this point in time. And the problem is not only that everything is labeled as magic realism if it comes from somebody who is Latin American or of Latin American descent. The problem has become the expectations, kind of the exotifying expectations of the industry, of people thinking, well, if you're Latin American, you have to write magic realism. This is the mode that you have to write in, and you cannot write anything else. So I remember at one point in my career that somebody told me, who worked in publishing, that Latin American people can't write science fiction. They said they write magic realism. They cannot write science fiction. They cannot write about robots, I think was a quote. And I thought that was kind of very strange because it implied that genetically it's impossible for me to write about something, like there's some kind of gene that I'm missing or a protein that I cannot process in my body that allows other people to write other kinds of things, but doesn't allow me to write this kind of stuff. So, I mean, the term magic realism was beneficiary for a number of writers, but I think it became, like I say in that essay, a bit of a chokehold. It became a way to contain and corral Latin American people in a certain place, and it also obscured a lot of writers from the field. I think the reason why people were so excited by the work of Roberto Bolaño, The Savage Detectives, was because it was not magic realism. I think that's the reason why people were so like, oh, what is this? Without realizing that there's a lot more stuff like that and like other stuff that they haven't read out there. So that's the problem with the term magic realism. I think putting all of my works by default on the magic realism shelf doesn't do anybody any favors when they're in conversation with other histories and with other contexts.
What a great answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Silvia. I had a question specific to Mexican Gothic. I'm currently teaching it in an intro to lit course. So, they read a lot of short stories, and they also are introduced to literary theory. So it becomes a really nice way to introduce, post-colonialism. And then they also read Yellow Wallpaper. So my question was, I've read, of your historical influences for this book, the Real del Monte and colonialism. But I was wondering, in terms of some of the literary influences that made this work, just because I see so much, but I'm curious, like, what was on your mind, maybe even like subconsciously, when you ended up writing Mexican Gothic?
Well, there were a lot of things, and not all of them are literary. Some of them are other things, movies, paintings, other kinds of work. But three people that were on my mind when I was writing it were Edgar Allan Poe, Horacio Quiroga, and then H.P. Lovecraft. And I wasn't really, and the novel Dragonwyck, which is a kind of a more contemporary Gothic. And by that, I mean, it's by Anya Seton, and it was not written in the 19th century. So it's a more recent Gothic. So I was thinking more about those works. I wasn't really, to be honest, thinking too much about the Yellow Wallpaper, specifically the text of the Yellow Wallpaper, although the writer was an eugenicist, so I did have that in the back of my mind. But Horacio Quiroga was he was called the Latin American Poe, and that was one of the things that I was going towards. And I was also going back towards Poe and a little bit towards Lovecraft, especially with certain short stories of him. He has a short story where there's body swapping. There's somebody that is kind of trying to inhabit the body of another character in that story. And Lovecraft is very concerned with family genealogies and deep dark secrets that suddenly emerge and complicated genealogical surprises, such as, in the shadow over Innsmouth, that the person is half-fish, basically. And family genealogies are obviously also a concern in Usher, in Poe's The House of Usher.
Mhm.
And in Horacio Quiroga, you have a lot of doomed people and kind of gloomy scenarios. Specifically, the one that I think my favorite one was El Almohadón de Plumas, the feather pillowcase, in which there's this woman who just gets sick and nobody knows what's happening to her. And that character and the relationship that she has with her husband, especially the opening lines to that short story, were instrumental in Catalina, in the character of the kind of doomed wife who is maybe wasting away in that kind of situation. So it's a lot of mix and match. I mean, Gothic has a lot of themes that repeat themselves, and you see them over and over again in many different scenarios. You can also look at Dracula and look at when Lucy is kind of ill and they're giving her transfusions, and look at that. That is another sick woman who's kind of trapped in a room, and people are not quite sure how to save her. That kind of situation. The waif in trouble. And then in the 1960s, we get a Gothic revival. And that's when we get the Scooby-Doo, what I call the Scooby-Doo Gothic, the Gothic romances that are very popular at the time. And those often involve a romantic plot where there's a woman who doesn't quite know how she can, there's this domineering, handsome man, and she quite doesn't know. Or maybe he's bad, maybe he killed his wife, or maybe he's a serial killer, and she doesn't quite know what's going on with that. And those often have kind of like a Bluebeard feeling to them.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was listening to you talk about. First of all, we loved getting to talk about the book and all the research you included in that, and then just hearing you talk about the inspirations specifically for Mexican Gothic. One of the things that we really enjoyed is that you had a playlist that went along with it. I'm changing up my question, guys. Just when is that something that you already kind of had in your mind as you were like writing it? Like, here's a song that kind of fits this certain scenario or character or theme, or is this something you kind of did after the fact? Is it like, oh, this is fun. This will kind of fit along with what I've written, and how they might fit in with the book.
I was listening to a lot of electronic kind of music at the time when I was writing Mexican Gothic, electropop kind of music. And when it came time to make a playlist, that my publisher wanted a playlist, I kind of took a lot of what I had been listening to casually while I was working on it, and I added some other stuff that I think should go in there to produce a coherent playlist. So some of those songs were songs that I really enjoy and that I was kind of looking at. The playlist is kind of a more cohesive experience, because sometimes I might repeat, 3 songs by the same band, or listen to a whole album. But in this case, it's more eclectic than that.
Well, I enjoyed it, definitely. Did you you were asking about the...
Yeah. So you kind of already talked a little bit about this with Jorge's question, with your inspiration for Mexican Gothic coming from other things that aren't literary. So I have a follow-up question. In at least 2 of your novels, you write about films or the film industry. So obviously you're a film buff, but I was just really curious if you had any favorite genres or favorite films that often inspire your writing?
I don't have something that constantly inspires my writing. It's a rotating kind of situation. Sometimes there is a certain work that I decide is interesting enough or is gives me a feeling or an idea that is interesting enough that I might pursue it later on, and so I go on. But it's not like I am always thinking. I'm not always thinking about the Roman Empire, and I'm not always
Yeah,
thinking
nice
about
one.
2001.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the Seventh Veil of Salome, which is my next novel, and it's out this August, that's set in Hollywood during the Golden Age. And when I was working on that, I was kind of looking back at my enjoyment of sword and sandal films of the time period, biblical epics. So when we would watch the Ten Commandments, because it was Holy Week at my home and everything was kind of religious themed, and they had all these old Hollywood movies, or they would show Cleopatra, which was another kind of historical epic, and Quo Vadis, all those kinds of movies. And I wanted to go back to this time period when those were the Marvel films of their time. Those were the big epics that every year there would be a something like that on the screen, and look at what it would have been to be part of that in that time period. So I wasn't necessarily considering, oh, I like, Samson and Delilah more than I like the Ten Commandments, but just in general about that epoch of cinema, and how those Technicolor epics had something to say that I found interesting.
Cool.
Awesome.
I guess I have one more question. So I've seen that you've edited some anthologies, and I'm an aspiring editor. So I was wondering if you had any advice for other students who are aspiring editors or myself in that journey.
I mean, quite honestly, I edited for myself. I kind of had a tiny micro press and I paid for it with the coins that I found under the couch kind of situation. It was not a money making operation, and it wasn't something, it was kind of like a hobby that I did because I wanted to. And so I ran Innsmouth Free Press uh, for a while, and I edited anthologies with a friend, and then invited people that I knew that were writing into these anthologies and had calls for submissions and all that kind of stuff. I think when people are young, they often start magazines. I guess that's what they do, or they join the editorial team. And so that was my own thing. So I didn't do this in a professional capacity of being a salaried employee or drawing any kind of salary like that. So that's how I basically learned to edit, by doing it myself, doing the whole zine thing. Except it was online, because online technology had come along at that time. But if it had been the 1980s or the 1990s, I would have probably been pasting together something like a lot of people do. So, I mean, that's I don't recommend that if you don't have any cash to spare. Not that I had a lot of cash to spare, but I would actually stop doing it because it was too time consuming, and I was kind of not going on vacation and instead spending my money for other things on this kind of stuff. But I wouldn't recommend that if you really don't have the time or resources to embark on this, to decide, oh, I'm going to start a magazine, I'm going to start a press with my friends. But while I did it, for the short amount of time that I did it, it was quite fun to learn how to do certain things, and talk to other people in the industry, and figure it out. But yeah, I didn't go to a publishing program. I don't have an MFA. I haven't taken creative writing classes at a master's degree level or anything like that. So a lot of this stuff just allowed me to kind of know more about this world without actually. It's easier to run a zine from your home than and ask your friends to contribute content than to take an MFA or pay for an expensive retreat for some stuff like that, or at least it was for me.
Okay. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. Anybody else have a question?
So, I mean, I guess to maybe just bounce off, because I know we don't have too much time left, but again, for our listeners who are also aspiring writers, you talk a little bit about like at some point making the decision to also make sure to spend time for yourself. So thinking about like work, a life balance. Have you been able to establish a routine that works for you in terms of a writing routine, or what generally works best for you?
Um, I worked full time for most of my career. So I wrote, I think, almost all of my novels except the last one or two. Yeah, I think the last two, Salome and Silver Nitrate. I wrote them while being employed with a 9 to 5 job and having children and being the breadwinner in the family and having a mother and other obligations also in my life. Um, so um, so I had to kind of make time for the things that were related to writing, and I kind of got into the habit of writing late at night.
Okay.
So once everything was kind of done around the household, to take an hour and a half, and right then I wrote during my commute on the bus. I wrote during my lunchtime. I took all these little pockets of time for myself. Um, in exchange for that, I don't watch television. I haven't watched television in a really long time, and I don't have any other hobbies. Basically, we all kind of make choices with the time that we have, and that's how I wanted to spend my time. But I did learn to give myself that, and tell others, tell my family from 9 to 10, I'm going to start writing, or from 10 to 11, I'm going to be writing. Those kinds of conversations that I'm not just staring at the screen, I'm writing from 10 to 11, so people know, oh no, she's available. She can make a grilled cheese sandwich. And it's like, it's 10, I'm kind of writing, sort of situation. So that was kind of it. Now that I'm a freelance writer, and I've been a freelance writer for the past 2 years, I don't have the 9 to 5. Now it's different because I carve my own schedule, and I just have to find enough work or stuff to do to pay the bills. And so it's become a different kind of, um, there's no kind of set routine normally, because it shifts and ebbs a little bit. So I'm going to El Paso, so that'll be 3 days where I'm not at home. I'm not doing maybe some of the stuff that I would normally be doing there. So it's kind of like a different relationship when you're a freelancer and when you have, sort of a full-time job. But the same principles apply of making sure that you are using your time judiciously. And Neil Gaiman said that what he does to himself is that he goes to a room and he puts the computer, and he basically unplugs the internet. And he can't do anything except sit in front of the monitor. So that's the trick. He can't be like playing Tetris on his phone or checking the newspaper or looking. And after a while, he gets bored. And so he just kind of starts writing. And getting into that kind of disciplined state does take effort, because I do know that at one point I was using my cell phone a lot to do a lot of things like doom scrolling just on social media, checking every Twitter message, playing Candy Crush. And it adds up. You don't realize it. I put a timer on my phone, and you don't realize it, but all these kind of small moments suddenly have consumed what you thought was going to be an evening, quote unquote, researching or writing. And you realize, actually, when you put the timer on, that you did 20 minutes of reading and researching, and you did an hour and 20 minutes of getting mad at the internet or looking at doodles. And that, that's just, it's hard to be honest sometimes with myself. I would sometimes be dishonest and say, no, I didn't really spend that much time on Twitter, now called X, or I didn't really spend that much time on Pinterest. But then I had to be honest, and I had to say, yeah, no, it is true. I did spend almost all of the time that I said I would be working on the Pinterest. And listen, it's more attractive than writing, because it gives you dopamine. You get, you're playing a game, you're looking at something, you get a rush. And sometimes with writing, it's not like that. I mean, our cell phones or lives are gamified. They know how to get us, and it's part of learning is how to get out of that kind of trap that the world is literally putting around you. And like I said, talking to your family and do let them know when it's your me time, especially when you live in small spaces. I'm talking to you from my dining room table. And so, sometimes people think that it's a free for all, right? It's like, oh, well, she's on the dining room table. She's not doing anything important. And just telling people it's important. It matters to me. Please support me. Don't come in at this time that I kind of have determined that is my writing time and chat my ear off for half an hour. Your mom, maybe she wants to talk about what her day was at the senior center, and it's like 10 p.m. and you're like, Mom, I'm sorry, I'll call you tomorrow, kind of situation.
Right.
But yeah, it's communicating and boundaries, but also kind of, I think, being very honest with yourself about what you're doing with your time.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I just have one closing question, Silvia, and it's kind of an open-ended question. For the people who are going to see you on Thursday, we know that in Gods of Jade and Shadow, you do feature at Paso. And so we were just wondering, have you visited here or what is it that you are familiar with as far as El Paso goes?
Oh, my grandmother had a bunch of postcards from El Paso from back in the day that they visited and that I found in a drawer and I have somewhere. So I always kind of thought they were really very fun. They had an alligator park, and I think they really had alligators there.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
So it was from hearing from those kinds of stuff that I became interested in. And I come from a border town. I'm from the north. I'm from Mexicali. So I think it's just this interesting nexus of where places meet, and borders are very porous always. And so I'm always interested in borders in general and in border towns. And El Paso was just like a town that I clearly remembered kind of people in my family talking about as being the place where they stopped when if they were traveling up north and going to the United States, that they went through El Paso on the train and that kind of stuff. So it was kind of an obvious route. I was like, obviously they have to go to El Paso because everybody went to, and they looked at the alligators in the park, which I think are not there anymore. And I'm really kind of sad about that. I don't think it looks exactly the same. But
no, but we do still have a really great sculpture by Luis Jimenez there that represents the live alligators in San Jacinto Plaza. So hopefully you can check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will. It just looked kind of really, really cute when I saw all those little postcards from back in the day with the little cars, the T models, and beep beep kind of.
So,
well, we're so excited to have you here, and thank you also again for speaking of time, how generous you are with your time today. With us here at Literally Literary. We're always messing that up.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Silvia. We'll see you in a couple of days then.
Okay, see you in a couple of days. Take care.
You too.
good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, recorded at Power at the Pass and brought to you by Border Census. This episode, we continued our discussion on Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode and follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.